Specialist Gwen Roth with the Hamilton County Soil and Water Conservation District. And we're back with a new lesson because we're all doing that virtual learning and social distancing. So today we're going to talk about fossils. And we're going to talk about a little bit of history in the city of Cincinnati. And I know, history might not be our favorite topic, but it's really actually fascinating. We're going to talk about way back history, and I'm not talking history of the pioneers. I'm not even talking about history of the dinosaurs. I'm talking about way back, about 4.5 million years ago. Long time ago. So, long before the dinosaurs, Cincinnati, actually in a period called the Ordivician period, which is just a made-up name that geologists and paleontologists put together to come up with time frames. Okay, so we come up with months. Paleontologists and geologists use time frames. So one of the time frames we're talking about is Ordivician, which is a long time ago. And in Cincinnati, during the Ordivician period, millions of years ago, we were covered in a warm, shallow sea. Now, when I mean shallow, I don't mean like only up to your knees or up to your waist. I mean shallow enough that the sun can penetrate to the bottom of the ocean. So it could still maybe be a couple 100 feet deep, but relative to ocean depth, that's pretty shallow. So back in the Ordivician period, millions of years ago, 450 million years ago, the city of Cincinnati was not here, but the area where the city of Cincinnati is was covered in a warm, shallow sea that might have looked something like this. Now, this is from a local artist, and that local artist's name is John Agnew, and he drew a depiction of what he thought the Ordivician Sea looked like 450 million years ago. Now, keyword, he thought that it looked like that. Because frankly, we have no idea what it looked like. People weren't around then. What we're left with is things like this and things like this. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together upside down. Okay? We take all of these clues that we find today in our local rocks, and we come up with ideas of what we think things looked like millions of years ago. Okay, so we have a lot of clues around Cincinnati, and we'll get to those clues in a little bit. But John Agnew put this together to say, this is what we think the ocean looked like in Cincinnati millions of years ago. Okay, lots of different types of animals. The thing is, we didn't have many plants, we didn't have any land animals yet. Remember, this is before the dinosaurs. Okay, so in this warm, shallow sea, we had lots of different types of things living around, eating each other, eating other things, eating detritus, the dead stuff, you know. So all of these animals were living in this sea. And today, what we're left with is things like this. Okay, so our lesson today is, how did we get from here to here, and what can we learn from these things, and where can we find these things so that we can go learn more information? So like I said, millions of years ago, Cincinnati was covered in this warm, shallow sea, and I am going to do a fabulous drawing for you guys. So I have my little whiteboard here, and we're going to pretend that this is our beautiful sea. Okay, now I'm not an art major, okay? So let's just start off with that right at the beginning. Now, think about an animal that lives in the sea. Think about your fish that lives in the fishbowl. Anything that lives in water, okay? It's swimming around, living a super happy life, and eventually that animal is going to die. I know it's sad to think about, but everything is eventually going to die. This little happy fish that's swimming around in your fishbowl is eventually going to die. Now, a couple different things can happen to that, okay? When they die, they might float up to the surface, okay? They might sink down to the bottom, okay? Or they might get eaten by another bigger fish, okay? Lots of different things can happen. But in order for an animal to be fossilized, a couple different things have to happen. Now, to be fossilized means to be preserved in a rock. Okay, you may have seen fossilized dinosaur bones at the museum center. You may have even seen fossilized Ordivician fossils in your own backyard. Okay, but fossilized means to be preserved in rock. So, in order for an animal to be fossilized, several things have to happen. Okay, first, that animal has to die. Okay, that's the first part of it. And they have to sink to the bottom of whatever water source they're in, okay, whether they're in a lake or a stream or a river, or in this case, the warm shallow sea, the ocean, okay? So this animal sinks down to the bottom of the ocean, okay, laying right there on the bottom of the ocean. Now, the thing is this animal going to automatically turn into a rock? No. Okay, that's not going to happen. What's going to happen to this animal? First, in order to be fossilized, this animal has to be buried. Okay? Now remember, this animal is dead, so it can't just pull out a shovel and start throwing sand on top of itself and bury itself. Okay? So somehow this animal has to be buried. Now, it can be buried in a couple different ways, but remember, there are other animals that are swimming around in this ocean. So as they're swimming, they're kicking up sand and burying on top of that animal. So the sand gets kicked up from the bottom and it starts to form a layer on top of that dead animal. Now, other animals are going to die in the process and be buried, and more animals are going to die in that process and be buried. And look, pretty soon we have layers upon layers upon layers of dead animals in the bottom of the ocean, okay, mixed with all this sand and all different types of things. Now, if you've ever been to the ocean, or maybe even your own backyard playing in the sandbox, and you picked up a bucket full of wet sand, is that sand heavy or is that sand light? Well, now if that sand is actually a bucket of wet sand, it's going to be pretty heavy. And depending on how big that bucket is, it's going to be really difficult to lift up. Okay, so think about all of these different layers of wet sand all piled on top of each other. Okay, this sand is smushing, smushing, smushing all the way down on top of all these dead animals. So now it's not these layers that are separated apart like this. Now it kind of looks like this. And all these layers are kind of mixed together. And remember, I'm going to draw this in a different color just so we can see it a little bit better. Remember, there's still all of our little animals that are stuck in there. And they're being smushed by this wet sand at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so it no longer looks like this. Now it looks like this. Now, the fossilization process happens, okay? And that's a really big deal. But basically, a lot of the minerals that are in the water and the sand are replacing the minerals that are in the hard parts of the animals. So think the shells and the bones and things like that. Because usually, when things are fossilized, it's not the soft parts. It's not the leaves, it's not the skin, it's not the eyeballs. It's usually the hard parts. Because those soft parts are going to start to decay and they're going to start to decompose. Okay, so it's usually just those hard parts, and the minerals that are in the sand and the water are being replaced and put into the minerals that are in those hard parts of the animal. So this is eventually, now we're talking millions of years, eventually turning into layers of rock. Okay, so we had our sand and our dead animals being smushed, that fossilization process, that mineral exchange, turning into layers of rock. Okay, kind of like this here. And I know this is hard to see. We'll get a little scan of it a little bit later, but you can see different types of layers all in this rock. Okay, and these are layers of dead plants and animals. Okay, actually not plants, dead animals that we have in here. Now, interestingly enough, 450 million years ago, when we had this warm shallow sea and all these animals are dying and they're being smushed up, how did that get into your backyard today? Well, that's a great question. Okay, so we have in Cincinnati, one of the most amazing places in all of the world to find Ordivician fossils. In fact, scientists from all over the world come here to Cincinnati to study our fossils because we have some of the best examples and we have some of the easiest access points to get to those fossils. Okay, so why did that happen and how did that happen? Well, actually, it happened a long time ago, okay? We had one continent at one time that was called Pangaea, okay? All of our continents were kind of together on Earth. And as those continents started to break apart, they didn't just flow apart from each other. Sometimes they bumped into each other as they went from places. Okay, and in fact that's how a lot of mountain ranges are formed. So what happened is the North American plate is starting to move, North America is where we live, started to move away from that giant continent, and also the European plate, where France and Germany and the United Kingdom are, started to move away, but at one time it kind of bumped into each other. Okay, and as they bumped into each other, it started to form up into mountains. Now, can anybody think of some mountains that we have here near Cincinnati? You're absolutely right. We have the Appalachian Mountains, sometimes called the Blue Ridge Mountains, okay? But our Appalachian Mountains were actually formed as those continents were shifting, and when they bumped into each other, they made a huge mountain form. Now, what happened here where we are, because we're not in the Appalachian Mountains, we had a slightly smaller bump, okay? So if we're looking at the east coast of the United States and we're kind of going along, and this was our mountains, and then we had a smaller little bump right there. And we call this small now, relative to the Appalachian Mountains. We call this small bump here the Cincinnati Arch. Okay, so all of this stuff right here that used to be in the bottom of the ocean and then got smushed down, it also got smushed sideways and formed up into this little arch. So here's all of our dead animals that were in that bottom of the ocean, and now they've smushed up into the Cincinnati Arch. So we still have all those little dead animals in there, fossilized, all these clues of what might happen in the future, or happened in the past, clues to us in the future. Now, still underground though. Okay, so how can we walk out in our backyard and find this that was buried underground millions of years ago? Well, in recent geologic past, we had something called the glaciers. And the glaciers were just giant sheets of ice that acted like big giant bulldozers. Okay, so you're outside playing in your backyard and you have a bulldozer pushing everything along. That's what the glaciers did. They came down all the way from northern Ohio and they pushed just like a giant bulldozer down through the state of Ohio. Now, as they were pushing down through Ohio, they actually knocked off the top part of the Cincinnati Arch. So what we're left with today is access to all of those dead plants and animals that used to be in the bottom of the ocean 450 million years ago. And that's the reason you can walk out into your front yard, your backyard. Maybe you even have a little wall somewhere by your driveway or by your front walkway that's made up of all these different types of rocks. And maybe you've never even looked at them before. But if you look closely at all of these rocks, you will find clues of animals that used to live here in Cincinnati in the ocean 450 million years ago, a long time before dinosaurs. So what we have and what we will include in comments to this video is a little guide that you can use to actually go out and find some of these things. So you can use this guide. It tells you a little bit about some of the animals and what they look like today. And then here's that picture again that we talked about, what it might have looked like then. So we have animals like Brachiopods, which really look like today's clams. Okay, and they would have a little tube. They could open up a little bit and they would have a little tube that would reach out and suck up some food from the bottom of the ocean. We have things, oh, this is one of my favorites. We have things like bryozoa. And bryozoa kind of look like little tree trunks. They're all kinds of little bryozoa. And bryozoa, actually, if you look closely at a bryozoa, you will see teeny tiny little dots in there. This was not actually the animal. Inside each one of these little teeny tiny dots was a little animal that lived in there. Kind of looked like a feather, would stick out from here, soak up some food, catch some food, and then come back in to digest. So I kind of call this like a hotel building or an apartment building, okay? Because all those different animals lived in there. And when you see today in a coral reef and you see all these little animals that look like they're fuzzy, that's what a brachiopod, or that's what a bryozoa looked like millions of years ago. We also have big animals. This would be an example of a cephalopod. Now, a cephalopod was that thing that looked like a giant carrot. I know, it's kind of silly to call it a carrot, okay? But that's kind of what it looked like. It was an ancient squid animal. And as the cephalopod grew, you can see its part of its head right up here where its tentacles were, that's how it ate, is bigger than its tail part down here. So the cephalopods are bigger on one end and smaller on another. And you can also see they have little chambers, little sections, okay? Not quite like tree rings where every time a tree grows, it gets another ring around it every year. Not quite like that, but similarly. So when you see pieces of cephalopod, you will see them bigger on one end and smaller on another. Now, the thing is, we don't know exactly what this cephalopod was. Maybe this was the tiny tail of a giant cephalopod, or maybe it was a little baby cephalopod and that's all the bigger it got. Okay, we just don't know all of that information because remember, we're looking at rocks like this and we're trying to put all those clues together about things that happened millions of years ago. So we think we know a lot of information, but scientists are always learning new things every day, and sometimes they find out they're wrong. And that's okay. That's the cool thing about science. We can learn from our mistakes. So sometimes even when we're wrong, we can learn new stuff about it. So if you guys have any questions about fossils, about the Ordivician period of Cincinnati, or where to get this cool thing, you can just write some comments down below and we will make sure to answer those. The one thing I do want to say though, if you go out and collect fossils, please, number one, be safe. Make sure we're practicing that social distancing so we're staying away from people and we're not getting people in harm's way. But also, you can't just take these from anywhere, okay? If you're walking around a city park or a county park, you cannot take the fossils out of there. So make sure wherever you're looking, if you want to take stuff home with you, make sure you have the permission from the people that own that land. Now, if it's in your backyard, I'm sure mom or dad might say yes, but remember, make sure you get that permission before you take anything out of that park. I hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe, and we'll see you again real soon. Thank you.